Hey there! Welcome back to another peaceful evening together. Tonight, we're stepping into a story carried on a melody, a single song spinning on an old vinyl record. It's Harold's story, and it begins on a quiet, rainy evening when he places the needle on a record he hasn't played in 40 years. As the tune begins, time bends, and he's back at prom night, holding hands with Rebecca, the only girl who ever made him feel truly seen. In those notes, memories stir, and the past finds its voice once more. Before we begin, if these gentle stories bring you comfort, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And in the comments, let me know where you're listening from, or if you'd like, share a song that still brings someone special to mind. Those small moments matter. Now, dim the lights, let the rain outside be part of the rhythm, and drift with me into tonight's story where one old melody carries the weight of a lifetime. The rain tapped softly on the window pane like an old friend stopping by unannounced. Outside, streetlights shimmered through the droplets, casting long golden streaks on the floor. Inside his quiet living room, Harold sat with a blanket draped over his knees, the glow from a small lamp washing everything in a calm amber hue. The smell of rain drifted in through a slightly cracked window clean, earthy, familiar. Somewhere in the distance, a train rumbled faintly, steady as a heartbeat. He looked across the room at the old record player sitting atop a worn cabinet. It had belonged to him since his 20s. The wood was scratched in places, its corners dulled by time. Most days, it sat in silence, like a relic more than a machine. Tonight, though, something in the air felt different. A quiet insistence, a nudge from somewhere deep inside. He rose slowly, his knees groaning in mild protest, and shuffled toward the shelf of records, gathering dust like forgotten stories. His fingers passed over album after album jazz quartets, big band swing, lullabies from another era. Then he saw it. A plain, dark sleeve, unmarked except for a white circle on the label, and a name written in careful cursive. Rebecca's Song. He hadn't played this record in over 40 years. The cardboard felt soft, worn at the edges, but when he pulled the vinyl out, it was still smooth, still whole. His hands trembled not from age, but from something else. A ripple beneath the surface, a memory calling back. He placed the record gently on the turntable and lowered the needle with care. A soft crackle greeted him, the sound of time itself waking up. Then came the first notes, slow, warm, and impossibly familiar. Harold closed his eyes, and just like that, the present dissolved. He wasn't 78 anymore. He was 17. The rain was gone, replaced by a spring evening in 1957. The gym was strung with paper stars and strings of white lights that blinked and twinkled like constellations in a man-made sky. Young couples danced in slow circles on the polished wood floor. Punch glasses clinked, laughter echoed, and there, across the room, stood Rebecca. She wore a powder blue dress that moved like water when she walked. Her dark hair framed her face in soft curls, and when she looked at Harold, her smile broke something open in him. She was the girl who had smiled at him when he thought no one ever would, the one who heard him, even when he didn't speak. That night, under those stars, they danced. Why had he waited so long to play this record again? Why tonight? Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was the silence in the house, the kind that settles into the corners after a long day. Or maybe some memories don't need to be remembered with our minds. They live in the things we keep close but untouched. A photograph in a drawer, a scarf in a box, a song on a record player, waiting for the needle to return and bring the past gently back to life. And tonight, that song had found its way home. The melody wrapped itself around the room like a warm shawl, soft and full of space. It wasn't just a tune, it was a doorway. As it played, images stirred behind Harold's eyelids, not sharp or sudden, but gentle, like watercolor bleeding into paper. He could almost smell the waxed floor of the old gymnasium again, hear the creak of folding chairs, the hum of excited voices. The song had played near the end of the night, when the energy had begun to settle into something more tender, more honest. Back then, he hadn't known it would become their song. It just felt like the right time to walk across the room and ask her to dance. Rebecca was talking with friends, laughing. He remembered the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear just before turning toward him. There was no hesitation in her yes, just a smile that lit up her whole face. As they danced, the music carried them not expertly, but gently. He wasn't a great dancer, never had been, but she didn't seem to care. Her hand in his, her other hand resting lightly on his shoulder, Rebecca swayed as if the whole world had slowed down to let them be. It wasn't just her beauty. It was the way she looked at him like she saw someone valuable. Not the lanky boy who stumbled over words. Not the shy kid who preferred books to basketball. But Harold. The real Harold. And that night, he saw himself through her eyes for the first time. He hadn't thought about that feeling in decades. Not because he'd forgotten it, but because some memories feel too sacred to disturb. Like a photograph you don't frame because the act of putting it out might somehow steal its magic. And yet here it was, coming alive again. The record player whirred softly, spinning its quiet spell. Rain continued to fall outside, but it seemed distant now, part of another world. In his mind, the sounds of the past filled the space instead. Rebecca's voice, the music, the laughter of friends, the echo of heels on wood. Harold remembered her asking, "Do you think the stars look different tonight?" He had looked up, chuckling at the ceiling decorations. "Paper ones?" "No," she said, smiling. "The ones we can't see." And he understood. There was something unspoken in that moment, a feeling that this night, this dance, was a kind of turning point. One of those rare slivers of time when everything feels perfectly in place. They talked about everything and nothing. Books they loved, dreams they hadn't told anyone. Harold had never spoken so freely with someone before. She listened in a way that made silence feel safe. That made him want to keep talking until the sun came up. He remembered how the lights dimmed slightly during the last dance, how she squeezed his hand just a bit tighter, how he wished the night wouldn't end. When the music faded that night, they had walked outside together. The air had been cool, fresh from an earlier rain. They stood under a flickering streetlight, her shawl around her shoulders, and he'd asked if he could write her. She said yes, of course, like it was the most natural thing in the world. The letters had come and gone. For a while, they'd tried. College, distance, life. They all pulled in different directions. But Rebecca never became sad for Harold. She became a place in his heart that no one else ever tried to replace, and he was glad for that. He smiled now, thinking of her handwriting on those envelopes. Elegant, rounded. How she always added a little drawing in the cornera flower, a music note, once even a tiny star. He wondered where she was now, if she were married, if she still danced when no one was watching, if she ever played the song and thought of him. Somehow, he hoped she did. Not every day, but maybe, sometimes, on a rainy night like this one, as the record neared its end. Harold let the silence stretch, hanging softly in the air. In that quiet, he could still feel the outline of Rebecca's presence. Not as a ghost, not as something mourned, but as something honored. He thought about how music carries pieces of us, how a few bars of melody can open a door to places we thought were lost, how the heart remembers more than we ask it to. He thought, too, of how often we try to move forward, never realizing that the past isn't always trying to hold us back. It's trying to tell us something about who we were, about who we still are. He slowly opened his eyes and looked at the record spinning, slower now. He hadn't expected the memories to come back so vividly. It wasn't sadness he felt. It wasn't regret either. It was something else, something still and grateful. Like a leaf, gently landing after a long journey on the wind. And maybe that's what this night was really about. Not trying to hold on to the past, but letting it speak. Let it say, you were loved, you mattered, and some things, like a song and a memory, never really fade away. The gymnasium smelled like lemonade, fresh wax, and something faintly floral, probably the dozens of corsages girls had pinned carefully to their dresses. Harold remembered it all so clearly, as if he were walking in for the first time again. Paper stars hung from string, swaying slightly with every movement of the crowd. The walls were lined with folding chairs, many now empty, as couples slowly claimed the dance floor. He had arrived early, more out of nerves than excitement. His mother had helped straighten his tie twice before letting him leave the house. She said he looked handsome, and he'd smiled, trying to believe her. But it wasn't until he saw Rebecca that he felt like he belonged. She walked in with a small group of friends, laughing, her blue dress catching the light with every step. It wasn't fancy, but it suited her, simple, classic, with just a hint of sparkle at the hem. She wore her hair half up, with a little white clip shaped like a dove. He watched her for a moment too long before working up the courage to approach. His palms were sweaty, and his heart thumped in his chest like it was trying to warn him away. But he walked over anyway. "Hi," he'd said, nearly tripping on his words. She turned toward him, her eyes widening just slightly in recognition. "Hi, Harold." That she remembered his name was enough to make his throat go dry. "Would you maybe want to dance later?" he asked. Rebecca tilted her head just a bit, then smiled. "How about now?" That moment those 4 words stuck with him more clearly than entire years of his life. The song playing was slow, with a smooth saxophone melody. She stepped closer, holding out her hand. He took it, unsure where to put his other hand until she guided it gently to her waist. They began to sway, a little offbeat at first. He stepped on her foot once, muttered an apology, and she just laughed. "Relax," she whispered. "I've got you." And somehow, she did. The music seemed to soften around them, the gym fading into a blur. All he could see was her. Her smile, her eyes, the way she moved so easily in rhythm. It felt like they were the only 2 people there. As they danced, they began to talk. Small things, at first what classes they liked, how terrible the cafeteria food was, whether they thought the chaperones would fall asleep by 10. She asked if he liked music. He nodded. "Any favorites?" He hesitated, then admitted he liked old ballads and slow jazz. "I knew it," she said. "You seem like the kind of guy who listens closely, like really listens." He hadn't realized until that moment how rare it was to be noticed. Really noticed. The song ended, but they didn't part. Another began, a little faster, and they kept going, laughing now, joking about how out of sync their steps were. At one point, she spun away from him and twirled back in, almost theatrical, before bumping into his chest. "You're not bad," she teased. "Better than the last guy who nearly dropped me." He grinned, his confidence growing. By the third song, he'd stopped worrying about how he looked. They took a break by the refreshment table, sipping from plastic cups of punch. Someone tried to light a candle in the middle of the table, but it kept flickering out from the movement of people walking by. Harold watched it struggle, its tiny flame dancing with determination. Rebecca caught him staring. "You always think that hard?" she asked, nudging him. "Probably too much," he replied. She leaned closer, her voice softer now. "I like that. It means you see more than most people." That quiet compliment hit deeper than any applause ever could. It felt personal. True. They wandered to the edge of the gym, away from the crowd. The music was softer there, the lights dimmer. She looked up at the paper stars hanging above them. "They're not perfect," she said, pointing to one with a crooked fold. "But from here, you can't even tell. Maybe perfect doesn't matter," he said. She looked at him, nodding. Exactly. They stood like that for a moment. Not touching, not talking, just being. He noticed the soft shimmer of her hair under the lights, the gentle rise and fall of her breath, the way her fingers fidgeted slightly with the fabric of her dress. Then the band started playing the last slow song of the night. Without a word, she reached for his hand. They returned to the dance floor, moving even more slowly now, more in tune. There was no awkwardness this time, just calm, just quiet connection. She rested her head lightly on his shoulder. He could smell her perfume, something sweet and delicate. It made him dizzy in a pleasant, impossible way. "Thanks for asking me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I almost didn't," he admitted. "I'm glad you did." They danced until the last note faded. And even then, they stood there a few seconds longer, holding on to the moment like it might drift away too fast. Later, after the lights had come up and chairs were being folded, they walked outside together. The night air was cool. They talked some more about summer plans, about how strange it felt to be growing up so fast. He offered to walk her home. She declined, but touched his arm softly, as if to say she appreciated the offer just the same. When they parted, he watched her disappear down the sidewalk, her silhouette outlined by streetlight and memory. And standing there, he knew without really understanding how that something had shifted. Something small but permanent had just taken root. He remembered walking home slower than usual, dragging his feet through puddles just to watch the water ripple. The scent of rain lingered in the air, earthy and fresh. He looked up at the stars, real ones, this time peeking through the clouds, and he thought about how one night could feel like the beginning of something, even if it never returned. When he got home, he slipped out of his shoes quietly so he wouldn't wake his parents. In his room, he sat on the edge of his bed for a long time, not ready to sleep, not ready to let go. He took the corsage she had given him a small white flower and placed it on his nightstand, where it stayed for weeks until it turned brittle and pale. In the days that followed, he replayed their conversation over and over. Her voice, her laugh, the way she made him feel seen. And he knew even then that no matter where life led them, this memory would be one he carried, quietly, tenderly, forever. In the days that followed, life moved on as it always did. Final exams crept closer. Summer plans started to take shape. and the prom became something people talked about in past tense. But for Harold, it lingered like a scent on a sweater feint, comforting, hard to forget. He and Rebecca exchanged a few letters after school let out. Her handwriting was neat and careful, with little sketches in the Marginsa sun, a leaf, a tiny bird. He read them slowly, sometimes more than once. She told him about the book she was reading, the small bakery job she picked up for the summer, and how she liked to sit by the lake near her house with her feet in the water. He had written back, though less often than he meant to. He was never quite sure what to say that didn't sound foolish, but each letter he sent was written late at night, after the house had gone quiet under the soft yellow light of his desk lamp. He poured into them the best parts of himself, the thoughtful parts, the parts he didn't always share out loud. And then, like so many things at that age, the letters stopped. Not abruptly, not with finality, just gradually. A gap between replies, a missed season, a change in pace. But it didn't hurt the way people always fear. Lost things will hurt. It was gentle, like the closing of a favorite book. You may not read it again, but you'll always know what it meant. Years passed. He went to college, started working, lived a whole life filled with all the usual chapters, jobs, friendships, routines. There were moments of love, yes, but none that glowed in his memory the way that one prom night did. That dance, that song, that version of himself he'd glimpsed, reflected in someone else's eyes. As he grew older, Harold came to treasure the rare things in life that felt entirely unspoiled. That memory remained one of them, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest, simple, whole. And now, sitting decades later in his quiet living room with the record spinning, he felt it all return not as a longing, but as a blessing. He had not lived a life without love, but some loves are not meant to last forever. Some are meant to arrive for just a moment, to awaken something in us, and then let us go on changed. Rebecca had done that for him, and as the record finally slipped into silence, he sat with that feeling. Peaceful, complete. Life has a way of shifting quietly, without dramatic announcements. One moment, you're writing letters in the middle of the night, and the next, your pen rests untouched beside a stack of unopened books. Harold couldn't remember exactly when the last letter came. He just knew there wasn't another one after it. There had been no argument, no painful goodbye. Just time doing what time always does, moving things gently out of reach. Rebecca had written about applying to a university out west. She was excited, nervous, full of dreams. He had read that letter slowly, imagining her somewhere far away, surrounded by new people, new possibilities. He wrote back, encouraging her, proud, in a quiet way. But he knew, even as he wrote, that the world was beginning to ask more of them than late-night thoughts and slow dances. He didn't resent it. Some people try to hold on too tightly, squeezing until what they loved slips through their fingers. But Harold had always understood the value of letting things rest, even beautiful things. Especially beautiful things. They hadn't made promises. That was something he'd always appreciated about Rebecca. She never asked for what she couldn't keep. Their connection wasn't built on what might be, was built on what was. A moment fully lived. A chapter complete in its own way. That summer, he often found himself reaching for the record she'd danced to, only to stop. It felt too soon, too close, so he tucked it back behind other vinyls, telling himself he'd play it when the time felt right. Years passed, marked not by milestones, but by quieter changes, a new job, a different apartment, new routines. He made friends, dated occasionally, lived life as it came, and yet, every now and then, something would remind him of her, a laugh in a crowd that sounded like hers, the scent of jasmine in early spring, a melody drifting from a cafe speaker that echoed faintly of that prom night song. And every time, he smiled, not sadly, not longingly, but with the kind of warmth that lives in the center of the chest, a reminder that something good had been his once. He had kept the letter with the little drawing of the star, folded neatly inside a hardcover book she had once recommended. He found it now and then during cleanups, and always paused before tucking it away again. Rebecca had never become a story he told often. Some memories aren't meant for sharing, they're meant for keeping. She lived quietly in the corners of his mind, like the soft hum of a distant radio. Not loud, but always there. Decades later, when someone asked if he'd ever been in love, he would sometimes smile and say, "Once," very quietly. They never asked more, and he never offered. It wasn't a secret. It was just sacred. And tonight, as the record player sat still once more, Harold realized something. He had never grieved what ended, because it never really ended. It had changed shape. It had become part of him. The way some music becomes memory, and some memory becomes something softer than nostalgia, something like grace. He had lived a full life on filled with small joys. Saturday morning walks to the bakery, conversations over tea with neighbors, books read and reread until the pages thinned. There had been kindnesses exchanged with strangers, letters he'd written to friends during quiet evenings. He had not married, but he had loved in many ways, some loudly, some gently. Still, when he looked back, that one dance on prom night stood untouched. Not above all others, but apart. It was the first time he'd felt truly seen, and in some ways, that moment had taught him how to see others too. Over the years, he had tried to describe that night to himself, tried to explain why it mattered. But the truth was, it didn't need explaining. It was simply true. As true as the stars they never got to see, but imagined anyway. Sometimes he wondered what would have happened if he had followed her west, if they'd tried harder, if fate had bent in their favor. But those thoughts never lingered, because deep down, he knew. Some people are meant to be your beginning, not your whole story, and there was no shame in that. In fact, there was something profoundly beautiful in it. The idea that a single night, a single dance, could leave an imprint so gentle and lastingent was enough. It had carried him through hard times, through loneliness, through change. It reminded him that he was once bold enough to cross a gym floor, nervous and hopeful, and offer someone his heart. Not for a lifetime, just for one perfect night. And tonight, as rain fell softly outside, and the old record sat in its sleeve once again, Harold felt no sorrow, only gratitude, because sometimes the quietest stories echo the longest. The room was quiet now. The record had stopped spinning, the needle resting still in its groove. Outside, the rain continued its gentle rhythm against the windows, like a lullaby meant only for him. Harold sat back in his chair, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes soft with the weight of memory. He wasn't sad. That surprised him. He had expected some ache, some whisper of longing. But what filled the room instead was something different, an almost sacred stillness, as though the music had not ended, but simply moved inside him. The story of Rebecca wasn't one he revisited often. It didn't need to be. Some memories aren't like books you reopen. They're more like sunlight through a curtain. You don't hold them. You let them touch you. He thought about how time smooths the edges of things, how the sharpness of youth's questions, its urgency gives way to something rounder, softer, understanding, grace. He didn't have the same energy he once did, but he had patience now, and appreciation. He smiled to himself, thinking of how nervous he'd been that night, how much courage it had taken to walk across that gym. It hadn't felt like bravery then, but now he saw the quiet heroism in it, in asking someone to dance, in opening yourself up to be seen, in allowing one moment to matter. It was easy to look at your life and see the blank spaces, the what-ifs, the almosts. But tonight reminded him that sometimes just one memory is enough. One night, one song, one dance. He looked around the room at the photographs on the shelves, the books stacked beside his chair, the record player that had waited patiently for so many years. This room, quiet as it was, felt full, not with noise, but with presence. And he thought, perhaps that's what aging is really about. Not gathering more, but realizing how much you've already been given. He stood slowly, knees creaking in the familiar way they always did, and walked over to the record player. He lifted the needle, carefully placed the vinyl back in its sleeve, and slid it onto the shelf. His fingers paused on the spine before letting go. There was no ceremony, just reverence. And then he turned off the lamp. The room dimmed to a soft twilight, lit only by the glow of the rain-lit window. He moved to the hallway, heading to his room, each step slow but steady. As he reached the doorway, he turned back for a moment. One last look. Not a goodbye, just a quiet thank you. He walked into his bedroom, the air cool and still, and settled under the covers. The sound of rain echoed more gently now, like a memory winding down. His pillow caught the scent of lavender from the sachet his niece had left him, and he smiled at the small kindness. As he closed his eyes, he thought not just of Rebecca, but of the countless tiny joys that had woven through his life unnoticed. The simple meals, the long walks, the kindness of strangers, the steady rhythm of ordinary days. They say life is made up of big moments, but Harold knew better. A life, he had learned, is made in the quiet, in the slow accumulation of laughter, music, memories, and love. Sometimes spoken, sometimes silent. His breathing slowed. The storm outside softened to a hush. And in that final thought before sleep, he realized he wouldn't change a thing, because even if his story hadn't been loud, it had been whole. The rain had settled into a steady hush, like a soft hand smoothing down the day. In his bed, Harold lay still, his breathing deep, even. The shadows on the ceiling shifted slowly with the passing headlights outside, like dreams beginning to take form. The hum of the old house surrounded him, familiar and kind. Nothing stirred. And yet, within him, everything was gently alive. Memories flickered, not as vivid stories now, but as feelings glimpses of a life well lived. He didn't chase them. He simply let them pass through, the way wind moves through trees without needing to stay. The melody from the record still hummed faintly in his chest. It had no words, no chorus, just that tender rhythm, the one that had once carried him across a high school gym floor, hand in hand with a girl in a blue dress. Rebecca, Her name didn't ache. It comforted, like a familiar book you no longer need to read to know how it ends. The kind of story that stays with you, even when you're no longer telling it. Harold's hands rested lightly on his chest, rising and falling with the rhythm of rest. He felt the weight of the blanket, the cool of the sheets, the warmth at his feet. All was quiet. And in that quiet, something beautiful unfolded. Not a memory, not a dream, just stillness. A deep, deep stillness. No need to look back, no need to look ahead. Only this moment, this breath, this peace. Outside, the world kept turning. The trees whispered. The sky held its clouds. The streetlights blinked like sleepy eyes. Inside, Harold let go. Not of life, but of the need to hold it tightly. He had loved. He had been seen. And he had remembered. That was enough. That was everything. And as the quiet wrapped around him like a soft lullaby, he drifted, not toward dreams, but toward rest. True, gentle, lasting rest. Some stories don't end with a final chapter. They simply settle into the quiet places of our lives where they live on in a favorite song, a passing scent, or a sudden memory that brings a smile. Harold's story wasn't about grand romance or perfect endings. It was about a momentone, fleeting, unforgettable night, and the love that quietly stayed, not to be relived, but to remind him who he was. And in the end, that memory didn't need to change. It just needed to be remembered. So tonight, may you rest, knowing that even the smallest moments can shape us, that even a quiet life can echo with meaning, and that somewhere in your story, something beautiful has already taken root. If this story brought you peace, comfort, or a gentle smile, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a kind comment below. Your words help us share these stories with others who need them too. Sleep well. You are safe. You are seen. You are loved. Good night.